The cowboy lost his horse, but the next day the horse returned with an Apache woman on its back. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The year was 1882 on the outer edge of the New Mexico territory, with a land stretched wide and dry, with mesquite and sagebrush scattered like forgotten debris. The cowboy had lived here for 3 years, keeping to himself in a cabin he had built with his own hands, raising a few cattle and surviving off the land. His name had not been spoken much in town these past months because he rarely went in except for supplies. At 38, he was older than most men who still tried to break land and claim a life out of it. He had lines around his eyes from sun and grief, and when he spoke it was short, steady, and only when necessary. He had come here after burying his wife in Texas. The fever had taken her fast, and the grave he left behind had been too heavy to stand near. So he sold what little he owned and moved west until he found a patch of land where no one knew him. His main mission now was not greatness, not wealth, not even belonging. It was survival without depending on anyone. He had the horse, the cattle, the rifle, and a small cabin with a corral. That was enough to justify his days, enough to make each morning worth opening his eyes. Or so he told himself. The gelding was everything, a bay, strong-backed, scarred from years of work, but steady under saddle. The animal carried him into the hills to hunt, hauled logs back from the timberline, and pulled him to town when food or ammunition ran low. The horse was not a pet, not family, but it was the last piece of life he trusted fully, the only constant that had not been stripped from him. Losing it would mean more than walking on foot. It would mean another piece of himself gone, and he did not know how many pieces were left. That evening, he came back from mending a fence along the west boundary. His shirt was stiff with sweat and dust, and his hands were raw from pulling wire. He noticed the corral gate was not latched. At first, he thought maybe he had forgotten, but he never forgot. His chest tightened. He dropped the coil of wire and moved fast to the pen. The rope tie hung loose against the post, the ground scarred with fresh tracks. The horse nowhere in sight. He stopped there, gripping the wood post hard enough for splinters to cut his palm. He breathed once, heavy. His jaw worked, but no words came out. The bay had slipped out or been driven. He could not know. He walked the line of tracks, 100 yards out into the brush until the light grew weak. The prints showed the horse running, not led by a rope. It told him it bolted, spooked by something. Coyotes, maybe a rider, maybe. He kept scanning the ridge, but the trail scattered where the soil hardened. The animal could be miles away by now. By the time the sun went down, the cowboy was already shaking with a frustration he could not show on his face. He cursed once under his breath, not at the horse, but at himself for not hearing it go, for not checking the latch sooner. He trudged back toward the cabin, boots dragging in the dirt. The silence around him was too wide, too sharp. He hated it more tonight than ever. Inside, the room felt smaller than usual. The table, the stove, the single bedroll in the corner. None of it filled the space left by the missing sound of hooves shifting in the corral outside. He set the rifle by the door and paced. His chest was tight, his thoughts circling like buzzards over carrion. He imagined the gelding lying broken in a gully or running off until it was taken by someone else. He tried to picture what tomorrow would look like if he had no horse to carry him the 20 miles to town, no horse to drag supplies, no horse to haul wood for winter. He had no answer. He pulled a chair to the window and sat, eyes fixed on the yard, though he could see little in the dark. Every sound outside made his hand twitch toward the rifle. He stayed like that for hours, stiff and restless as the lantern burned low. His mind dug back to Texas against his will, his wife's last breath, the stillness in the cabin where she had died, the grave dug into clay, the way the world had stayed silent afterward. Tonight felt like that silence again, as if he was being stripped bare piece by piece. At midnight, he went back outside, pulling his coat tight against the chill. The corral looked empty and wrong, the gate yawning open like a wound. He closed it firmly, tied the rope, though it made no difference now. He set the lantern on the porch rail and sat on the steps, leaning against the post, eyes on the horizon. He thought about saddling another man's horse in town, offering coin to borrow it, But he knew what they would say. What's a man worth who can't hold on to his own? He wasn't going to be that man. Fear gnawed at him in a way he hated to admit, not fear of bandits or hunger, fear of failing to hold on to the one thing left that tied him to life. The horse was his work, his safety, his last partner. If it didn't return, he would be no better than a drifter with a shack. That thought pulled him taut until his shoulders ached. He forced himself to stand and walk the yard one more time, eyes straining into the dark. Nothing moved. The coyotes called in the distance and the brush whispered with night wind, but no hooves, no breath, no familiar shape. His stomach sank low, a weight that dragged through him. Back inside, he set the rifle within reach, lowered the lantern, and stretched on the bedroll, but he did not sleep. His mind refused to still. Every creak of the cabin made him sit up. Every whisper of wind made his pulse jump. He told himself he would rise at first light and follow the tracks again, take food and water, and walk as far as it took. He clenched his fists and swore under his breath that he would not lose the gelding without a fight. When the first thin gray of dawn pushed at the window, his eyes burned from the night without rest. He sat up, boots already on, and listened hard. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, faint and steady, came the beat of hooves. His chest locked tight. He froze, every muscle straining toward the sound. The hoofbeats grew closer, clearer, slow and uneven, as if the animal had been pushed hard through the night. The cowboy stood in the doorway with his rifle close to hand, his heart thumping harder than he wanted to admit. The gray light of morning spilling across the yard in a thin wash that made every shape look unfamiliar. Then the bay gelding came into view, lathered with sweat, head low, sides streaked with foam. Relief hit him first, sharp and sudden, almost painful in its force. But that relief froze when he saw the rider. A young woman sat bareback on the horse, her knees pressed against the animal's ribs, her hair hanging in tangled waves over her shoulders. She was not dressed like any townswoman he had seen. Her skin was bronze from sun, her features sharp and proud. Her dress was torn along the neckline and clinging to her hips where the fabric had ripped. Bare feet hung down on either side of the horse, scraped and raw from travel. She didn't raise her hands, didn't call out, didn't beg. She just looked at him steadily, her chest rising and falling fast, as if every breath was both relief and warning. His grip on the rifle tightened. He thought about bandits, about raiders, about what kind of trouble a woman showing up on his horse might bring. He thought of what neighbors would say if word spread. An Apache woman on his land, he's a fool to let her in. His jaw locked against the thought. The barrel of the Henry shifted upward, but he didn't raise it to his shoulder. He studied her eyes instead. There was fear there, yes, but not the wild fear of someone about to strike. It was a guarded fear, a fear that matched too well the silence in his own chest these last years. The gelding stopped in the yard on its own, sides heaving. The woman slid down carefully, almost falling because her legs trembled. She landed barefoot in the dirt and stood straight, shoulders squared despite the exhaustion pulling at her body. She said nothing, only waited. That unsettled him more than if she had cried or pleaded. He realized his first thought was not that she might harm him, but that she might collapse right there in front of him. Questions crowded his mind faster than he could sort them. How had she come upon his horse? Did she take it in the night, or had the horse found her and carried her here? Where had she come from, one of the camps, scattered beyond the hills or farther north, fleeing something worse? Why was she alone? Why did her dress hang torn at the neckline, showing the soft line of her chest as if she had fought or escaped someone who meant her harm? Was someone following? His instincts said to demand answers, but his throat stayed dry. Instead, he took one step forward, his boots heavy on the packed earth. She flinched slightly, not from fear of violence, but like someone who had been struck too many times to risk guessing what came next. He stopped where he was, trying to quiet the anger rising in him. Not at her, but at whoever had left her in this state. The horse blew out sharply and dropped its head toward the trough. The cowboy motioned with one hand, not raising his voice. "Water's there." She hesitated, then guided the gelding forward with a light touch. She poured water from the bucket with trembling fingers and let the animal drink. Only after the horse was done did she take a sip herself, cupping her hands. The water spilled over her wrists, running down skin marked with dust and bruises. He knew now she was not just a thief who stumbled across his horse. No thief would treat the animal before herself. No thief would stand in his yard steady and silent instead of bolting. He weighed his options. He could order her out, send her back into the scrub, where she might last a day or two before hunger or men caught her. He could ride her into town and hand her over, let others decide what to do. But the image of her eyes, dark and steady, even as her body shook, stopped him. He saw the same hollow look he had seen in his wife's eyes the night before fever took her, the look of someone who already knew the world had no mercy left to give. The rifle felt heavy in his hand. He leaned it back against the porch post. That was his decision made simple. She watched him closely, as if that one motion told her everything. She didn't thank him, didn't speak. She just lowered herself onto the step near the trough, wrapping her arms around her knees, resting her head down for a moment. He saw dirt ground into her skin, bruises along her elbows, and a patch where the fabric had torn completely, leaving her thigh bare above the knee. He looked away quickly, but the image stayed sharp in his mind, stirring things he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He thought again about the night before, about how the horse had bolted. He realized now it hadn't been spooked by coyotes. It must have carried her willingly, or she had found it in the brush and climbed on. Maybe both. The gelding had always been steady about people, maybe steadier than he himself had ever been. For the first time since his wife's death, the cowboy felt the ground beneath him shift, not in danger but in responsibility. Someone had landed here, carried by his horse, and the decision of what to do next sat squarely in his hands. He hated decisions that could not be walked back. But when he looked at her again, barefoot, bruised, silent, he knew he could not put her back into the scrub. He exhaled slow and controlled and pushed the words out plain. "You can stay for now." She lifted her head just enough for their eyes to meet for a heartbeat. He thought he saw relief flicker there, not much, but enough. She nodded once, almost invisible, then lowered her gaze again. Inside, the cabin waited with the smell of smoke and beans from the night before. He would have to offer her food, maybe a blanket. Questions could come later. For now, he had already made the hardest choice. The horse snorted at the trough and shook its mane. And for the first time in months, the cowboy felt the faint pull of something close to gratitude toward the animal that had not only come back, but brought more than he had lost. The cowboy stepped aside and motioned toward the cabin door, his jaw set, his mind still tight with doubt. But he had already made the choice, and there was no undoing it now. She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes scanning him as if measuring whether this was another trap. Then she rose carefully from the step, her bare feet dragging slightly in the dirt as she crossed the yard. He noticed her limp now, slight but there, and he wondered how many miles she had walked before climbing onto his horse. He pushed the thought down and opened the door. Inside, the cabin was plain and narrow, built from pine he had cut and hauled himself. The stove still held some heat from the night before, and the smell of ash lingered. A tin cup, a plate, a heel of bread, and a few beans in a pot were the only things on the table. It struck him how bare the place looked, with another pair of eyes taking it in. He gestured at the chair by the stove. "Sit." She looked at the chair as though unsure whether she had the right, then eased herself down, her body stiff with both exhaustion and caution. He ladled beans into the tin plate, set it down in front of her, and pushed a fork across the table. She stared at the food, then at him, her hand hovering before she finally picked up the fork and ate, quick and hungry, but not greedy. Each bite she swallowed like someone who didn't know when the next would come. He watched in silence, arms folded across his chest, his mind sorting questions he wasn't sure he wanted answers to. Where had she come from? Who had torn her dress? Who might come looking for her? But when she glanced up at him once, her eyes sharp but tired, he said nothing. When she finished, she pushed the plate back as if afraid to take more. He poured her water from the jug. She drank with both hands on the cup, her fingers trembling slightly, the water spilling down her wrist again. When she set it down, she murmured something low, words he didn't understand. Apache, maybe. The sound of it was hot but carried a weight, and he nodded once, though he didn't know what it meant. He went to the trunk in the corner, pulled out a folded wool blanket, and set it on the table beside her. She touched it carefully, then pulled it around her shoulders. The sight of her wrapped in his blanket stirred something inside him, both protective and unsettling. He sat down across from her, his scarred jaw twitching as he considered speaking. But again the words died before reaching his tongue. The silence stretched. She looked at the fire, then at him, then at her hands. Finally, she raised her chin slightly and spoke in broken English. "You know, safe?" The words were flat, more a test than a plea. He met her gaze steady. "No, not tonight." She searched his face, and he wondered what she saw there, whether she believed him or thought it just another lie from another man. He leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under his weight. His thoughts circled. If anyone from town found out, there would be questions he couldn't answer, suspicions he couldn't fight. Some would call him a fool, others worse. But he also knew if he turned her out, he'd spend the rest of his days remembering her standing barefoot in his yard with that look in her eyes. And that memory would cut deeper than the scorn of neighbors. She shifted in the chair, pulling the blanket closer. He noticed then the bruises along her wrist, dark and uneven, like fingers had dug into her skin. His stomach turned cold. He had seen bruises like that before, on men dragged by lawmen and on women who had no one to defend them. He looked away, jaw clenching, because asking about it would mean facing answers he wasn't ready to hear. To break the silence, he pointed toward the bedroll in the corner. "You take that. I'll sit. Watch." She looked at the bedroll, then at him, then shook her head. "No, I sit." He didn't argue. Instead, he pulled a chair to the door, set the rifle within reach, and sat down heavily. She lay down near the stove instead, curling onto the floor with the blanket wrapped tight. He noticed how she kept her face turned toward him, even as her eyes closed, as if ready to wake at the first wrong move. The firelight flickered against the walls, throwing shadows across her face, across the curve of her shoulder where the blanket slipped. He shifted uncomfortably, staring at the rifle, trying to keep his mind on guard duty instead of her presence. It had been years since he had shared space with another living soul, and already the air felt different, heavier, and less lonely at the same time. He hated himself for noticing. He hated himself more for wanting her to stay. As the hours dragged on, his thoughts churned. He wondered who she was running from, wondered if men might be on her trail, if they'd come riding into his yard with rifles ready. He weighed the risk of keeping her, the danger of standing against whoever had put those bruises on her. But he also thought about the empty nights behind him, the long years of silence, the weight of grief that never eased. He thought about how, for the first time in years, he was not alone. Near dawn, the fire died down to embers. He hadn't closed his eyes once, but he wasn't tired. He kept watching her, her breathing slow, the bruises on her arms visible where the blanket slipped. He knew he couldn't send her out. Not now, not ever. Maybe. And that realization sat heavy, but certain in his chest. When she stirred awake, blinking in the pale light, she looked at him from where she lay on the floor. He waited for her to speak, but she didn't. She only sat up, pulled the blanket tighter, and began to braid her tangled hair with slow, deliberate motions. He realized then that survival wasn't new to her. She had been surviving long before she stepped into his yard, and maybe, just maybe, they could survive together. The pale light of morning crept across the floorboards, and the cowboy rose from his chair by the door, stiff from sitting all night, his eyes gritty but sharp. The Apache woman was already awake, sitting by the stove with the blanket draped around her shoulders, her hair braided neatly down her back. She was different in the daylight, the bruises on her arms darker, the tired lines around her eyes clearer. But there was also something steady in the way she held herself, as if she had made a decision in the night too, that she would not beg and she would not flee. He stepped outside first, boots crunching against the dirt. The gelding lifted its head from the corral, ears twitching. Relief struck him again at the sight of the animal, whole and alive, and he walked to it, running his rough hand along the sweat-dried coat. The horse shifted but stood calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. He checked the hooves for stones, the legs for strain, then patted the neck once. The gelding had carried her hard, but had come back. That counted for something. When he turned, she was standing in the doorway, blanket wrapped tight, bare feet pressed against the cool boards. He realized then that if she stayed, she couldn't remain barefoot. The ground here was harsh and cut sharp. He thought briefly of the small pile of worn boots in the corner of the cabin, relics from years gone. He would find her a pair later. For now, he motioned to the well. Water. She nodded and stepped carefully across the yard, filling the bucket, lifting it with both hands though it nearly toppled her. He moved quickly, taking the weight before she spilled it, setting it on the porch with ease. She gave him a quick glance, not gratitude exactly, more like recognition that he hadn't let her struggle when he could help. Back inside, he cut a piece of bread and set it on the table with a small slice of salt pork. She ate slowly this time, as though learning that food would not be taken away. Between bites, she looked around the cabin, at the tools hung neatly on the wall, at the rifle propped by the door, at the stack of firewood in the corner. Her eyes paused longest on the picture frame lying face down on the shelf. He noticed and moved it without explanation. It held the faded sketch of his wife, and he wasn't ready to see both women in the same room. After the meal, he pointed toward the axe leaning against the wall. Wood. She hesitated, then followed him outside. He split the first log with a clean swing, the crack echoing through the still air, then handed the axe to her. She gripped it awkwardly, her hands small against the worn handle. Her first strike barely cut into the grain, and she looked at him quickly, as if bracing for anger. Instead, he took the axe back, split another piece with calm precision, and handed it over again. She tried once more, harder this time, and though the log didn't split, the blade bit deeper. She breathed out through clenched teeth. He saw the bruise on her wrist darken as the muscles pulled, and for the first time he spoke more than a single word. Enough, not today. He took the axe gently from her hands and set it aside. She stepped back, frustration in her eyes, but also relief. He didn't ask her name that morning, though it hovered on his tongue. Instead, he showed her the chores. She carried water inside, swept ash from the stove, and gathered scraps of cloth from the trunk to patch her dress. He gave her an old shirt of his, rough and long, to wear over the torn fabric. She slipped it on without shame, the sleeves hanging loose, the hem falling just above her knees. The sight of her in his shirt unsettled him in a way he couldn't place, but he didn't take it back. As the day warmed, they worked side by side without speaking much. She washed the tin plates in the basin, while he repaired a broken rail in the corral. She braided strips of cloth into twine while he cleaned his rifle on the porch. Every so often their eyes met, and each time neither looked away first. In the afternoon, as he led the gelding into the shade, she approached quietly, her hand reaching to touch the horse's neck. The animal shifted, then settled. Accepting her as if it had always known her, she stroked its mane with slow, careful fingers. He watched, his throat tight. That horse had never allowed anyone near without his say-so. Something passed between them then. Unspoken but undeniable. The animal had chosen her too. Later, when the sun dipped lower, she gathered small stones and twigs from the yard and arranged them near the stove. He frowned, confused, until she began grinding the stones together, making a powder she sprinkled over her bruised wrist. The smell was sharp and earthy. He realized then she carried knowledge of healing, of remedies he had never seen. She glanced at him, then back at her work, as if warning him not to interfere. He didn't. He only filed it away. She was not helpless, not by far. As night came on, he made another pot of beans. She sat near the fire, sewing her dress with careful stitches using a needle and thread she had found in his trunk. He caught himself watching her more than once, the slope of her shoulders in the firelight, the concentration in her eyes as she pulled the needle through. She noticed once, and for the first time, she did not look away quickly. She held his gaze a heartbeat longer before returning to her work. When the meal was done, she ate quietly, then pushed the plate back with both hands, signaling she was finished. He cleared the dishes, his movements slow, steady. She pulled the blanket around her again and lay near the stove, but this time she did not face him directly. Instead, she turned slightly, showing she trusted him enough not to keep her eyes locked on him through the night. That small shift struck him harder than he expected. He sat in the chair by the door again, rifle within reach, staring at the dark through the cracks of the shutters. His thoughts churned. He still didn't know her name, didn't know her story, didn't know what danger might be trailing behind her. But she was here under his roof, working his land, sitting by his fire. That alone meant the course of his life had already changed. As the flames burned low, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and whispered under his breath, "You're here now." The words weren't for her, not really. They were for himself, a quiet acceptance of what had already been decided by the horse, by the land, by fate he didn't want to name. And when he looked back toward the stove, her breathing had slowed into the rhythm of sleep. The blanket pulled high, the rough shirt of his hanging loose around her frame. He felt the weight of the silence shift again, no longer empty, but full. And for the first time in years, he didn't dread the coming dawn. The morning air was cool when the cowboy stepped out with the bucket to draw water. As the rope creaked against the wood, he heard the soft scrape of the cabin door. She followed him barefoot into the yard, his shirt hanging loose around her frame, the blanket still around her shoulders. He looked down at her feet, raw and cut, and finally spoke more than a single word. "You'll need boots." She didn't answer, only looked down at the ground, her braid falling over one shoulder. He studied her for a moment longer, then set the bucket aside and went into the shed. He came back with a pair of old boots, cracked at the seams, but solid. He placed them on the porch without explanation. She watched him, then bent down and slipped them on. Too big, but better than nothing. She tugged the blanket tighter and stood straighter, as if putting on the boots meant claiming a place here. They ate bread and beans again, and he saw her glance at the empty shelves. Supplies were running thin. He knew he would need to ride into town soon, and the thought weighed on him. If he took her, there would be stares, questions, maybe worse. If he left her, she'd be alone here, and he wasn't ready to trust the quiet safety of the cabin without his watch on her. The decision gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside, one day at a time. After the meal, he brought her to the corral. The gelding nickered softly as she approached, and she reached out, stroking its mane with easy confidence. He watched closely. "Horse carried you here. Why?" The words came out blunt, the question he had been holding since dawn 2 days before. She turned toward him slowly, her dark eyes steady. Her English was broken, but clear enough. "Horse found me. Night." He frowned. "You take it?" She shook her head, her voice low. "No, horse come." The certainty in her tone struck him. He wanted to doubt her, but he couldn't. The gelding's calm behavior confirmed it. An animal didn't lie. As the day stretched, he showed her more of the work. She carried small buckets of feed, swept the cabin floor, and fetched wood he had split the day before. He noticed the way she studied everything, learning silently. She wasn't just surviving, she was building a place for herself. In the afternoon, he took her down to the creek. The water ran cold, shaded by cottonwoods, and he knelt to fill the canteens. She crouched nearby, cupping her hands to drink. Her hair loosened in the breeze, strands slipping from her braid. When she bent forward, the collar of his shirt gaped open, showing the curve of her chest where her torn dress still hung beneath. He caught himself staring, heat rising in his chest, and turned his face away quickly, jaw tight. But when he glanced back, he found her eyes on him, steady and unflinching. She didn't cover herself, didn't shrink. Instead, she let the silence hang between them until the air felt heavier than the water at his knees. He cleared his throat and capped the canteen, forcing his focus back to the task. They walked back in silence, the sound of boots crunching against dry earth. At the cabin, she set to patching her dress again, threading a needle through cloth with deliberate precision. He mended a broken strap on the saddle. Now and then, their eyes met, and each time it lingered a moment longer than before. When the sun dipped low, he pulled a tin of coffee from the shelf and brewed a small pot. The bitter scent filled the room. He poured 2 cups, setting one in front of her. She looked surprised, then lifted it carefully, sipping slow. After a while, she spoke again, voice rough from disuse. "Name? Nia?" He froze, the word hanging in the air. She had not offered it before, and he hadn't dared to ask. He nodded once, steady. Nia. He waited a beat before adding, Ethan. It had been a long time since he'd said his name aloud to anyone, and hearing it now felt strange, almost foreign. Her lips shaped the sound softly. Ethan. That night, after the meal, she lay again near the stove, the blanket pulled over her. He sat in his chair, rifle nearby, but the air between them was different now. Names had been exchanged, a fragile step towards something more than survival. He watched her as she braided her hair once more before lying down. She glanced at him, and for the first time there was no guarded suspicion in her eyes, only exhaustion and something close to trust. Before she drifted asleep, she spoke quietly, words halting but clear enough. You good man. He felt the weight of it settle in his chest. He wasn't sure he deserved the words, but he didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed on the dying fire. For the first time in years, he felt the silence in the room was not empty, not punishing, but full. He let himself breathe easier, though he knew the questions weren't done. The danger, the peace, the judgment of others. But tonight, with her breathing steady by the fire, and his horse resting calm outside, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The next morning, the cowboy rose early, the sky still pale with the first stretch of dawn, and set about preparing the gelding for a ride. Supplies were low, beans, flour, coffee nearly gone, and though he could stretch what little they had for a day or two more, he knew waiting would only make it harder. He moved with deliberate care, checking the cinch, testing the straps, his hands steady, but his mind pulled in different directions. He had not ridden into town since before the horse bolted, and now he carried more than the need for food. Now there was Naya in his cabin, and she was a risk the town would never forgive if they discovered her. She stepped outside as he adjusted the saddle, her braid hanging loose from the night, her borrowed boots scuffing against the dirt. She stopped a few feet from him, the blanket still over her shoulders. Her eyes dropped to the packed saddlebag, then lifted to his face. She did not ask the question, but he heard it anyway. Would he leave her here or take her with him? He tightened the strap hard, the leather creaking under his hand. Town, he said flatly. Her brow furrowed, her lips pressing tight. She took a step closer, blanket slipping from her shoulders. Me? Ishe? She asked quietly. He shook his head. Too dangerous. He could picture it too clearly. Faces turning, whispers starting, rough hands reaching to drag her off the horse before he could draw the Henry. No, he would not put her in that circle of hate. She stood still, her eyes fixed on him, something sharp flickering in them. Abandonment, maybe, or fear. He met her stare evenly. I'll be back, he said. It was steady, but inside he felt the weight of the promise press hard. If someone followed him back, if word got out, she would pay the price. If he didn't come back at all, she would be left alone in a land already set against her. She finally nodded once, but he saw the way her hands clenched in the blanket. He reached into the shed, pulled down the old double-barrel shotgun, and set it inside the doorway. If trouble comes, use it. Her eyes went to the weapon, then back to him. She didn't nod again, but her grip on the blanket eased, as if the gesture itself mattered more than the gun. He rode out under a sky-washed pale blue, the land stretching wide and silent around him. His thoughts tangled with every hoofbeat. He pictured her in the cabin, sitting by the stove, eyes darting to every sound. He hated leaving her, but he hated more the idea of someone in town learning what was under his roof.